The van had 10 seconds to spare. It should have been a routine run through the lower docks, a narrow cut through warehouses where minutes, shaved into pay, and a few extra bills meant dinner for a granddaughter. The air smelled of salt and oil and something sweeter underneath that tasted like old cigarettes and fried dough. Two men in cheap jackets were dragging a third, blood dark on an expensive cuff, toward the shadow of an iron gate. Arthur stood with his shopping cart of returned bottles because a routine habit had kept him later than usual, because the city had taught him to keep one eye open, and because his hands still remembered how to move fast when the world demanded it. He saw the cuff, the expensive shoes scuffed with sea mud, and he reached without thinking, a cracked wrist moving like those years when he had hauled concrete and fate had taught him speed. He shouted, he waved the grocery list like a flag. He stepped forward, and the smaller of the two thugs turned and pushed him hard. The old man did not fall. He did not fall because his knees had learned to brace for storms. He held his breath, felt the sour copper taste of fear, and let the words come out like a warning, not an intervention, not a prayer. He said, "Stop. You do not want to know what happens when you mess with him in this part of town." The tiny, ridiculous voice of authority from a tired throat split the alley. The taller thug laughed, an ugly, wet sound, and the younger one swung. Arthur threw the only thing he had in his hand, a crushed tomato can from his cart, and it hit the taller man between the eyes with a dull metal thud. The sound cut the night like a small gun. The two men hesitated. The man they had been dragging wheezed, turned his head, and Arthur saw him fully for the first time. Hair combed back decades too well, a sleeve with a stain like a rosette, a face that had learned to give orders and take something like pity as a thing to be traded. For a second, the alley existed as 3 breaths and a can on concrete, and then the world rearranged itself, because the battered old man had not just made a mess, he had made a choice. Arthur grabbed at the sleeve, dragged the man toward the light of a vending machine, and in the lamplight he said, "Listen to me. You are sick. Go home and do not look back." The man coughed and laughed, a thin sound that tasted like coins. He did not say his name. He didn't have to. The air vibrated with a promise Arthur couldn't name. He pushed the shopping cart away with a foot and nudged the injured man toward the scooter where his granddaughter Anna kept extra blankets. He saved a life, he told himself, a human thing, and he did not yet know that the life he had saved owed debts that stretched like spider webs through the city. The thugs ran, not because Arthur was brave, but because something in their eyes told them stairs and fences were better than the reputation on the other side. Arthur climbed onto his ledge and waited for the echo to die, the diesel coughing in the distance, the metallic clink of a can in his cart like a small metronome for the next wrong choice. He had $20 a week to make up. He had a granddaughter who slept with her head heavy on an old pillow. He had a habit of telling himself stories that would keep them fed, or at least this was the story he could tell as he helped the man onto the scooter, wrapped his coat around the blood in the expensive cuff, and pushed the motor into a sputter that would become their escape. The alley smelled of rust and coffee and something cleaner when they moved into the street. The man with the tailored shirt said, rasping, "Thank you." Arthur felt the syllables like a ledger being opened. He had no idea then that the city had eyes on this ledger, that cameras and cars and the gossip of corner boys kept ledgers of their own. He did not know that within an hour, a rubber stamp in a hotel room would mark his face as an actor in a drama much larger than anyone on the block. The first stretch after the incident was raw. The injured man, who would later be named Salvatore Romano by those who both feared and loved him, leaned on Arthur as if the weight of his history could be steadied by a grocery cart and a worried set of hands. They moved fast through wet stairs, the scooter engine a wheeze that laced the night. Sirens felt like a promise that might be unrelated. The two thugs were a rumor behind them, and Arthur's mind unspooled with practical thoughts because that was what his life had taught him. He checked the bandage his granddaughter would make in the morning, felt the dampness of blood through cheap cloth, smelled the iron and a faint lemon that came from the man's aftershave. They reached a stairwell that smelled of old boots and bleach. Arthur knocked on a service door he had used for shelter in winter. A man named Rosa let him in because the neighborhood owed its elders small favors. The injured man coughed and whispered through a fog of pain, "You could have let me die." Arthur answered with a shrug that was more honest than his words, "Some things you cannot do to another human." The thugs had called out a name as they left, a name that made the air thud like a bass drum, a name that meant the wrong kind of attention. Arthur did not know it then, but the name was a dot that would string together a necklace of threats. Dialogue in that cramped service room turned into a slow negotiation of life and truth. Salvatore kept asking questions between short, ragged laughs that cut like paper. Rosa poured hot water into a tin cup, and the steam smelled like towels and old soup. Arthur asked questions that were small and precise, like a man learning the edges of a wound. "Who are you to them?" Salvatore said, voice like gravel. Arthur did not know whether to be scared or proud. Their words were clipped and close, and other names arrived, names Arthur had heard scrawled on the sides of takeout boxes years ago. Tony Ritchie was a consigliere who kept accounts in a black book. Elena was Salvatore's estranged sister. Detective Harris was a city cop who did not yet realize the extent of the ledger he tracked. Nurse Priya had hands that could find where pain lived. Salvatore, the bus driver, had once seen Salvatore buy a newspaper and pretend to read it. Javier, the trainer from the rec center, had a temper and a soft heart. Martina, the owner of the bakery, said nothing but left a slice of pie. Each voice added like a brushstroke until the scene felt like a painting one could not walk away from. The thugs had left a trace, a cheap lighter with initials that smelled of rubbing alcohol and diesel. And Arthur turned it over between his fingers with the tiny, practiced curiosity of someone who had once unraveled locks. The man in the suit coughed again and said, "They will be back." Arthur nodded. He had learned how to listen to the city and to men who had eaten other men's futures. At the end of that first long hour, a decision needed to be made. The man in the suit wanted a doctor and a bed. Arthur thought of the hospital where they charged eyes as if stitches were elective. He thought also of the thugs, of what a hospital would reveal and what a safe house would hide. The room smelled of canned tomatoes and the city pressing against the windows. Arthur looked at the man again, at the line of his jaw that had once commanded rooms, and he decided that the best he could do was hide him somewhere small and known. Anna had an extra mattress. Rosa had a cupboard with old linens. They moved like thieves who were politely asking permission. Arthur had a backstory he never told at dinner tables because it sounded like a different life. He had been a mechanic in his 30s with hands that could make engines sing. Later, he had been a volunteer at a community center where he taught boys to fix bicycles. Later still, he had been the kind of father who missed birthdays because he worked double shifts. He had lost a wife to the hospital and learned that everything cost and little of it came back. The other protagonist in this story also had a past that smelled of cigars and office smoke, and a ledger of favors and sins written in fountain pen. The man's history was long enough to be called a career. He had been a runner once, then a negotiator, then someone who learned to ask for loyalty with a look and to accept betrayal as part of the price. He had watched men stand and fall, had learned practicalities of protection and the dangerous arithmetic of power. Both backstories were long and messy and stitched together with small aches. Arthur had scars in his hands and a picture of a granddaughter tucked in his wallet. Salvatore had a ring that he kept with a habit of touching when he thought about the past. Their histories were different, but their loneliness was similar, something that filled the room like warm milk. The first big decision was to take the man to Anna's apartment, a tiny box of a place above the bakery where the heater rattled and the smell of fresh bread always eased a little of the city's bite. They wrapped the man in blankets, washed the wound with water that had the metallic note of city pipes, and made a plan that was equal parts improvisation and old-school cunning. They put the man in the back bedroom, under quilts, and they told each other stories to keep the night from dropping like a net. Their conversation became a map of small obligations. Arthur called Detective Harris under pretense of reporting a disturbance in the docks. He kept the conversation casual, feeding enough truth to keep a cop interested, but not enough to invite the force. "There were some kids down by the piers," he said, voice careful. "They were making a racket." Harris's reply was a low hum, a sound like the city itself. Arthur felt the weight of being an informant without wanting to be one. He thought about hospitals, about the risk of cameras, about how a man like Salvatore had enemies who kept long memories and short tempers. The thugs would check alleys, ask questions in bars, look for patterns. They would use phones and walkers and the kind of gossip that spreads fast because it profits those who feed it. At 30% into their improvised timeline, the narrative needed something that would pull viewers into the fold. "If this were your street, what would you have done?" the story asked without asking. "If this were you, would you have saved him?" There is no easy answer. Pause and think of your own life for a second. Would you risk your small safety and the fragile cover of your routine for a man whose shoes announce a world you had not been invited to? Answer in the comments with a simple yes or no and your reason. Some will say they would because people are people. Some will say no because survival makes hard choices. Your answers matter more than you think because they shape how stories like this get told and how the next call to action is judged by neighbors who watch and remember. Share whether you would have stayed at the door or walked away. Tell us in a sentence and mean it. Your community shapes these narratives. Now we return to what happened when Arthur decided to stay. The soundtrack of the next days was small noises and big stakes. Surveillance tightened on them without robes or banners. Someone was watching the bakery window. Someone took a picture from across the street and posted it on a low-traffic forum. A car idled too long at the corner, and the smell of its interior told a tale of coffee and cologne. Arthur learned how to listen to the hum of radio scanners, to distinguish police chatter from taxi dispatches, to sense the difference between a municipal van and something more ominous. The thugs sent 2 messages via a friendly guy named Javier who bumped into Arthur near the rec center and said, "You should not meddle with things bigger than you," as if the threat could be contained in a friendly voice. The man they had saved, Salvatore, insisted he would go to a doctor, and he named people who should be protected and people who should be warned. Their conversations became long and sharp. Dialogue multiplied into a web. In one crucial scene, Arthur and Salvatore sat in Anna's kitchen with a map spread like a confession between them. The kettle hissed, and the radio played an ad that felt obscene. They argued. "You should disappear," Salvatore said, each word slow as a man counting coins. "I cannot," Arthur said, not because he wanted the story, but because he was the kind of man who could not look away. "Where would I go? My granddaughter needs me." Salvatore's mouth twisted. "Do not make me choose between you and the debts I carry." The exchange went on, each sentence a small thrust. They spoke of old loyalties, of a man named Tony who could be called for a favor, of Elena who might take advantage of a distraction to do what she wanted. Their voices rose, sank, hesitated, and the scene expanded with details of the kitchen, the scuff on the table, the smell of stale coffee, the sticky note with a telephone number Arthur had forgotten to call, the bruise on Salvatore's cheek changing color like fruit gone soft. There were 12 distinct exchanges in that hour-long conversation, each adding layers of subtext. Arthur kept touching his left hand where a burn had left a pale scar, a physical punctuation that punctured the sentences with human hesitation. Salvatore inhaled and tasted metal. He remembered a woman who had left a note once, and he touched the ring as if to steady his own memories. Each had a subtext of fear and stubbornness, of gratitude and reluctant acknowledgement of the dangerous math that had led to that cramped kitchen. The city began to look like a chessboard. Cameras blinked. A small community radio host named Martina mentioned a man seen limping near the docks. And suddenly, someone who wore an expensive cuff had 3 sets of eyes looking for him. Arthur and Salvatore made a logistics plan that read like a manual for ghosts. They needed a fast route out of sight, a drop point, someone who could exchange cash for an identity for a few days. Tony Ritchie was the first call, because he held information and because he had reasons to keep a certain kind of trouble at bay. But Tony was also a ledger keeper. Favors he wrote down would be cashed in with interest. Detective Harris, who had been nudged by Arthur's initial call, started to ask questions about who had reported a disturbance at the docks. He was not malicious, he was curious, and his curiosity smelled like duty. A brief technical paragraph about surveillance. Modern urban tracking relied on a mesh of public cameras, license plate readers, and a network of private feeds. Analysts cross-reference timestamps, triangulate mobile phone pings within a window of minutes, and then prioritize leads by degree of criminal exposure. A single plate seen at the docks twice in an hour becomes a thread that can unravel alibis. That process takes hours and sometimes days, but it is precise enough to tell you where a car stopped and who might have been inside. They use that knowledge against them by moving at odd hours, by switching routes, and by relying on human memory over digital records. Movement became choreography. Arthur and Salvatore planned a sequence that involved a bakery delivery that Anna would make as a cover, a fake delivery slip, a bus route that Salvatore would drive and not ask questions about, a hidden spare key at the back of a stoop, and a plan to get Salvatore to a safe house owned by an old friend named Domenica. The plan relied on details and on the kindness of people like Martina and Salvatore, who understood what it meant to owe someone a day of peace. They practiced language, they rehearsed faces, and they packed small things in a knapsack. Each moment of tension was stretched, slowed. One such moment came when Salvatore had to cross the market and a man with a familiar jaw stopped him. They prolonged the exchange into a slow dance of excuses and half-lies. The air smelled like cumin and sweat, and the man who stopped him had the taste of copper in his mouth from an old tooth. They spoke in small phrases, 40 seconds, that felt like a lifetime. Another moment happened when Arthur looked back and saw headlights where none should be. He was 3 heartbeats from shouting when a bus rolled between them and stole the sightline. He had to choose to run or to keep walking like he had not seen anything. He kept walking. That decision saved them and cost them in other ways. The ambush was not what anyone expected. It happened in a parking lot behind an old factory, a place where the city kept its discarded dreams. Salvatore knew the lay of this place. He had once owned a piece of it with a handshake and had later sold that trust. The 2 thugs had followed, and they had friends. Arthur felt the first bullet of panic like a bee in his chest. There were 3 cars, and the air tasted of burned rubber and cheap perfume. They had expected a confrontation, but not the number of people who were waiting with maps of their own. Dialogue filled the space like a rain of small charged fragments. "You sure this is the place?" hissed one thug, voice like a new bruise. "He was here," another answered, but uncertainty shook the claim. Tony Ritchie had lied, not maliciously, but like a man who kept books with the intention of trading entries later. He had sent a message with coordinates that led them into a net in order to bait a rival. Salvatore realized that the stakes were no longer his alone. He whispered to Arthur, "Trust no ledger that is not sealed by blood." The words were theatrical, and they landed heavy. There were 14 exchanges in that scene alone as men moved like pieces and words like knives. Rosa shouted from a balcony, "Get out of there now!" A shotgun clicked in the mouth of a car. The tension paragraphs here slow the motion in careful detail. A cigarette butt tumbling down a gutter, the scrape of shoes on gravel, the scrape of a metal chain, Salvatore's fingers finding Arthur's, and the old man's palm being rough and steady and alive. The small acts of human contact were unexpected armor. Revelations came fast. Tony had set them up to flush a mole, a traitor in Salvatore's organization who had been trading names for a better margin. The ambush, intended to capture Salvatore, instead revealed that someone in his inner circle had been feeding information to a rival faction. Hidden in the chaos was a folded photograph with a face Arthur recognized from the bakery line. Martina had taken it with a smile and tucked it into her apron. The betrayal tasted like cold bread. Salvatore's voice when he spoke was stripped of its old command. "I have lost more than men," he said. "I have lost the pattern of trust." The confession was heavy. Arthur, who had never believed in grand plans beyond keeping Anna fed and warm, felt the tilt of a life committed to a stranger. There was a scene where Salvatore and his consigliere Tony argued like brothers, and their language flattened into raw trade terms, into numbers and lists, into debts. Collected like taxes. The argument had 8 exchanges, and each one dragged history into the present, a ledger calling due its oldest debts. The city, which had once seemed like background, now felt like a participant. Cars with tinted windows watched the pharmacy where Anna picked up milk. Cameras dwelt on laundromats, and someone left a card at the bakery with only 3 letters that spelled a threat. They had to choose to move or to stand and fight. The plan became a confrontation, because a life like Salvatore's cannot be hidden forever. The final confrontation took place in an abandoned textile mill, where light came through holes in the roof, and the smell of dust was like a memory of factories that once fed a neighborhood. The place had catwalks and chimneys and the sound of rain that had not yet fallen. Arthur moved with a surprising economy of motion, a small man with calloused fingers doing what he could with nothing but a carrot of grit and an old elbow. There were long exchanges of dialogue that read like wills and choices. Salvatore's, positioned like a man trying to bargain with fate, asked for one thing: a clean exit. The thugs wanted retribution and a chance to carve their names into a story they could tell at bars. They approached like wolves in cheap shoes. The confrontation had long beats of silence that stretched, then snapped. The fight was not cinematic in the way movies promise. It was close, messy, bruising, a negotiation of breath. Arthur used misdirection, a pile of sacks thrown to the ground to create noise, a discarded wrench to wedge a door. He had learned mechanical improvisation and used it. He loosened a latch, released a pulley, triggered a cascade of noise that made the attackers flinch. He shouted, he lied, he promised things he did not have. "There are cops on the way," he cried, though he had no proof. His words were a gamble that momentarily bought them seconds. Salvatore's found a way to use his presence like armor, to make himself a living bargain, trading his own visibility for Arthur's safety. In the end, the ambush turned into a retreat because the attackers were uncertain and because the mill's echo amplified every uncertain heartbeat until fear looked like cowardice. There were multiple paragraphs of drawn tension that slowed the sound of footsteps, the metallic creak of a gate, the wet scrape of clothing. The final sequence of exchanges reached 27 lines between men who had everything to lose and men who had nothing left to gamble. When the dust settled, consequences arrived like unpaid bills. The police did show up because someone had finally called in a tip, not out of civic duty, but out of opportunism. Detective Harris arrived with a flashlight and an empathy that had a limit. He took statements, he wrote names in his pad that made Arthur feel suddenly smaller and exposed. Salvatore's, because of the wounds and because of the witnesses, was taken in for questioning and later in the week released under conditions that felt like a leash. Tony Ritchie vanished for a while, and rumors said he had been to see people who smelled like citrus and old money. Martina put a sign in the bakery window that read, "Nothing," but invited people to buy bread and not to ask questions. Anna cried and then folded towels because she had to keep the apartment livable. Arthur found himself at the center of a storm he had not sought. He was offered, anonymously, a card with a number and a promise of relocation. He was told that the man he had saved might be called a hero by some and a purse by others. The community reacted in splintered ways. Rosa asked for a small favor in return. Salvador the bus driver left a bag of oranges on Arthur's stoop. Detective Harris warned him with a look that carried more than the words he used about being careful who you help. There was a scene of community reaction that named the secondary characters. Tony Ritchie still whispered through his alleys. Elena showed up later asking questions that were sharper than she looked. Nurse Priya provided stitches and convalescence with a clinical tenderness. Javier the trainer refused to take sides, and Martina kept the bakery open as if nothing had changed. Their actions were practical. Someone bought Anna a new pillow. Someone else kept an eye out for men with cheap cologne. The epilogue began 1 month later. 1 month after the night Arthur had shoveled his life into a grocery cart and pushed a man with a dangerous name into a bedroom, the city had moved on in small ways. Salvatore had been summoned by men who demanded apologies and explanations, but those men had learned that debts can be renegotiated. He visited Arthur in the morning and left a small envelope with cash and a note that read simply, "Thank you." Arthur refused most of it and kept one bill for Anna and one for himself. The neighborhood started to stitch itself back together with the kind of slow patience that comes after a storm. Martina baked a loaf with an extra crust that she slid across the counter to Arthur. Martina said, "You did the right thing." He said, "I do not know yet." The city still hummed with rumor. People who owed favors called them in, and Arthur found himself with a new ledger of obligations that smelt faintly of citrus and old ink. He had lost sleep but had gained a certain respect in the alleyways where he had once gone unnoticed. Elena stopped by with a story she had ripped from a paper and pasted into a notebook. She said, "Maybe we should tell the truth someday." He told her, "Maybe." 3 months after the incident, the pattern of consequence had hardened into something both better, worse. Salvatore had decided to step back from certain visible acts. He had, for a time, been less public in his transactions and more present in quiet meetings that felt like rehabilitation by negotiation. He paid for a small community fund anonymously to help families who had lost jobs. The act felt like a bribe and a repair at once. Arthur had taken a small payment and used it to fix the heater in Anna's apartment and to buy a second-hand moped, an odd purchase that made the neighborhood murmur. Detective Harris stopped by for coffee more than once, and the conversation turned from suspicion to an uneasy truce. In the local radio station, Martina told a story that did not name names, but praised the community that helped one of its own. This gave Arthur a strange kind of visibility that was not entirely comfortable. The thugs who had attacked at the start were quieter, but the ledger had only been rewritten, it had not been erased. People who had been on the outside sometimes moved inward and sometimes moved away. Arthur found that his hands shook less at night. Anna slept deeper. His granddaughter began to train at the rec center where Javier taught a class in self-defense, and the neighborhood began to hold small classes on safety, on how to look out for one another. 6 months later, the city had settled the dust into a pattern you could read. Salvatore had negotiated a truce at a table with men who preferred to keep arguments local rather than turn everything into arms and blood. He had donated to the bakery fund and quietly funded a scholarship at the rec center under a name that was not his. Arthur had been given an anonymous card that offered a position as a caretaker at a small community garden outside the docks. No one knew who sent the card, and Arthur did not ask too many questions. He took the job because it was honest work and because it meant Anna could sleep without worrying about rent. Someone had left a note at the garden gate that read, "For those who plant hope." The city was still complicated, and the ledger still had entries, but there was a small net of protection and a shifting sense of redemption that did not erase past harms, but soften their edges. Detective Harris had a theory about how people like Salvatore could be nudged toward better outcomes if communities offered nets and not only punishment. It was a controversial theory, but it worked in small cases. The bakery flourished, and Martina made a special bread named after a story she would not tell fully at breakfast. Arthur visited Salvatore once, in a small room with treatment plans and visitors who smelled like antiseptic. They sat and drank coffee that tasted like old mornings. Salvatore touched Arthur's knuckles with a careful reverence. "You saved me more than once," he said. Arthur answered, "We saved each other in the way that matters," he said. The final scene in memory was not a triumphant parade, but a small private exchange. A month after the first visit, a woman named Elena sent a radio piece into the community program that told a story about how neighbors had kept each other safe. 3 months later, the rec center had received a modest donation under an anonymous name, and Javier the trainer held an extra class for girls and boys who needed to learn confidence. 6 months after the initial night, a plaque was nailed to a tree in the community garden with a small inscription that read, "For the hands that reach when it is hardest to do so." Arthur stood before it with Anna on his arm and a loaf of Martina's bread in his pocket and felt the city beneath him like a living thing that could sometimes be taught to forgive. The story did not end with absolution. It ended with a complexity that suited both men. Salvatore never became a saint. He paid fines and rearranged certain habits. Tony Ricci was seen less in public and more in back rooms. Detective Harris kept an eye on public ledgers. The thugs had been dispersed, some behind bars, others scattered into quieter lives. The community was bruised but still capable of small mercies. Arthur had traded none of his history. He remained an old man with a grocery cart and a stubborn heart. He had saved a man who had once been called a boss, and in doing so had entered a ledger of obligations and goods that would not be simple to balance. The city kept its secrets and its rewards. In the end, a stranger left a simple envelope at Arthur's door containing a postcard that read, "Courage is contagious." He kept the postcard in his wallet and read it on nights when rain ladled like coins on the window pane. If you were on that street, in that alley, would you have stepped forward? The answer sits in lives we all share. If this story moves you, subscribe for more narratives where ordinary people must choose between the safe path and the human act. Share your thoughts, and remember that sometimes a small warning from an old man can change the shape of a city.